In this task, we will take care of the footer element. Now, I already went ahead and completed this task. There were a lot of design decisions that went into the process I thought were important to talk about, and so that's what we're going to spend time discussing in this video. This task asks us to create a footer at the bottom of each page. It'll have the current version number of the application, which will be shown dynamically. We'll have some links with a logo on the right-hand side, and all of it will be covered with a Cypress test. And then we're also told here for some help, we can use a Chrome extension called Pixel Perfect, which we will take advantage of. All right, let's get started. So on the left here is our picture of our desktop version, and on the right here is our mobile version. And both are within a Flexbox container. And the question is, where are we going to put the footer? Looking at our mobile first design, we essentially have two choices. We can put them inside the main component or after the main component. And the advantage of placing the footer inside main is that main actually controls the display of its children with Flexbox. So adding the footer wouldn't ask from us any additional styling. But this really doesn't follow the W3 specs, which encourages us to put the footer after the main seen here on the left. And that's what we want to do. But that brings up another issue. As we see here, the desktop version, we have the sidebar navigation extending all the way down, giving us a two-dimensional shape. And when we hear those words two-dimensional, that really should clue us in on grid. So when it comes to displaying our elements, we want to use grid to help us. So let's now look at our grid setup. The div container here is going to have a display property of grid. And to make sure that it manipulates its children, we had to add a class to the sidebar navigation so that we can assign it a grid area. Now let's take a look at that styling. And our mobile first design here, which is default, will give us one column and 3 rows. And you see the grid template areas for that. You'll notice that the column is 1 fraction, and we give the container a height of 100 viewport height in order to allow it to take up the space that we need vertically. And for the rows here, the sidebar navigation and the footer both have auto. By default, flex items are just as wide as they need to be in order to contain the element's content. No more, no less, and that's really what we want. But for the main content, we give it 1 fraction, and this will allow it to take up as much space possible vertically. So that is the mobile first design. Here in the desktop version, we have 2 rows and 2 columns. And you'll notice that the navigation expands the entire first column. And this column has an auto size, which will be enough to contain the content, just what we want. And the second column, that will receive 1 fraction, allowing it to expand horizontally the rest of the view. Now the first row here is given 1 fraction, and we want that main content to expand as much as possible horizontally. And the footer is given auto so that it can take up only the amount of space allotted for its content. And we did work on the main. Its sizing was being controlled by flex and min height. And to bring back its flexibility, we gave it a flex property and then flex 1, which will allow it to grow and shrink appropriately. Let's take a look at the footer. Here is our initial setup. We have a p tag for the version, and we'll get to dynamic setting later. We have a nav element, which contains unordered list of footer links, and we have the image. And when it comes to the placement on the page, I use Flexbox, and to help in that process, I created a footer in Storybook. To fit the Figma design dimensions, I gave it a width of 1280. And here is that initial setup. My default protocol for spacing elements, which I suspect is for most folks, is to use justify content. And Flexbox allows us to work with the moving of elements in a couple of ways. One way is we can distribute that space between and around the elements. So if I come in here to the footer and reset everything, then all elements are pushed to the side. And what justify content will do is it will take that spacing and space those elements evenly. Now this works for the flex items across that main axis, but we can also work with the alignment across the cross axis up and down. And for that, I used the align items. But when we check our work so far against the designs, we see here that the nav elements are off center a bit. They are to the right a bit. So what can we do? Well, a Flexbox allows us to distribute space in a container. And we saw that with Justify Content, which is concerned about distributing that space between and around the flex items, like that. But Flexbox also allows us to distribute the space within the element, which is the marvel of Flexbox. And to do that, we can use the flex property. So what we'll do is we'll toggle the Justify Content, take that off, and we will give our P element flex property and give it a value of 1. And you'll notice that it takes up the available space in the flex container. We can also work with moving the image, so we can do the same with the image. And you'll notice that we do get equal distribution of spacing because these are both 1 fractions, but our image is huge. And that's because the browser will keep the aspect ratio of images. The height of the image matches the width appropriate to its original ratio. And that's why we see it change size as the window size changes, but our font never did change. To bring our image back down to its appropriate size, we could use object fit, but Flexbox can help us with this. We can wrap the image in a div element, and that works because Flexbox only affects its children, and when wrapped in the div element, image would be a grandchild. So that way, the div spacing is distributed and not the image. So here we have our div element with the image wrapped inside. And now when we go back, our element is inside. We'll have to reset our work. And you'll notice when we hover over our image, its sizing is appropriate, but the div now is expanded. But we have our new problem. We need to move that image to the end to fit our design. And what we did is we gave it a display property of flex, so we turned it into a flex box. And then now that it's a flex box, we see that we have our flex box here, and now we can manipulate the space. And we don't want to manipulate the space inside, we want to manipulate the space around. And that should key us off to do justify content. And we'll do justify content flex end to push it towards the end. And when we match it up against our design, we see we have a very good fit. When it came to styling, we saw some important factors of padding and gap of 24. We also saw important factors of the text, like text medium normal, appropriate color, appropriate height. We have a height of 60 here. Those all went into the design here, giving it a gap of 24, some padding, appropriate. The other big element was the ordering, and you'll see here that the links are first, then the image, then the text. And for that, we use the flex order. The logo changes to the second position order for mobile. The footer links are placed first, and then the version is placed last. And in order to make sure that the version is placed first in the desktop, we reset it to its default with a 0. And now when it comes to dynamically setting the version, we could have imported the version number, but there were some security issues. So we went with configuring an environment variable, and we set that up in the config file of Next.js. For the testing, we wrote a couple tests. The main important one is that it needs to render the application version from the package JSON and placed first there. The others are not so important, but I still added them. Here, we're just checking that the links are available and that they have the appropriate attributes. One last thing to check was the mobile first. We hadn't done that, and that works